Nigel Farage has just lobbed what might be the most explosive legal grenade in modern British political history, and the target is sitting in number 10 desperately trying to pretend everything's fine while his entire electoral strategy goes up in flames. We're talking about a full-blown judicial war over Labour's suspected attempt to manipulate election timing. And if Farage's legal team has the receipts they claim to have, Keir Starmer's government might be facing a constitutional crisis that makes Partygate look like a vicar's tea party. This isn't your standard political squabbling in the Commons. This is lawyers in wigs, court documents flying, and the very legitimacy of our democratic process being dragged into the courtroom. Buckle up, because this is about to get absolutely mental. If you're not already subscribed to British Mirror, now's the time to hit that button and smash the notification bell, because we're about to unpack a political scandal so juicy it could sustain the 24-hour news cycle for months, and you'll want front row seats for every delicious development. So let's start with the basics, because this story has more layers than a Parliamentary Select Committee's final report. Elections in the UK are supposed to happen at predictable intervals. The Fixed-Term Parliaments Act was meant to stop prime ministers from playing political games with election timing, though it's been repealed and we're back to the old system where the PM can essentially choose when to go to the polls within a 5-year window. Constitutional flexibility, they call it. Tactical manipulation, everyone else calls it. The system's designed to give the governing party an advantage, which is already dodgy enough, but what Farage is alleging goes way beyond the standard constitutional fiddle. According to documents Farage's legal team has filed, there's evidence suggesting that Labour has been systematically delaying calling an election that by conventional standards and historical precedent should have already happened. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's just politics, isn't it? Governments clinging to power, trying to pick the most advantageous moment? Sure, that's standard operating procedure, but here's where it gets properly interesting. Farage isn't just moaning about political gamesmanship. He's arguing that the delay violates constitutional conventions, undermines democratic legitimacy, and potentially breaches specific legal obligations around electoral timing. He's not playing politics, he's playing hardball in court. The timing of this legal challenge is absolutely chef's kiss perfect from Farage's perspective. Labour's been riding high in some polls, but struggling in others. The economy's doing that annoying thing where the statistics say one thing, but people's lived experience says something completely different. Starmer's personal approval ratings have been on a roller coaster that would make Alton Towers jealous. NHS crisis is still raging, energy bills are still painful. In other words, it's exactly the kind of messy political environment where an incumbent government might want to delay facing the voters for as long as constitutionally possible, hoping something, anything improves before they absolutely have to call an election. Now here's where Farage's strategy gets genuinely clever, and say what you will about the man, but he understands political theater like few others. By launching a judicial challenge rather than just whinging about it in the media, he's elevated this from political noise to serious constitutional question. Courts have to respond to legal challenges, judges have to rule on them, the media has to cover them. Starmer can't just brush it off with a soundbite and move on. He's got to engage with the legal process, which means lawyers, court appearances, and a sustained news cycle that keeps the question of Labour's democratic legitimacy front and center for weeks or months. But wait, because it gets even better. Farage hasn't just filed some vague complaint hoping something sticks. His legal team has apparently compiled evidence of internal Labour communications, policy decisions that only make sense if an election isn't imminent, and scheduling choices that suggest they're deliberately running the clock. If even half of this evidence holds up under scrutiny, we're looking at a government that's been caught red-handed playing fast and loose with democratic norms. And if there's one thing the British public hates more than politicians generally, it's politicians who think they're clever enough to game the system without getting caught. The response from number 10 has been, shall we say, illuminating. The official line is that this is a politically motivated stunt by FARAGE, that the government will call an election in due course, and that they're focused on governing rather than playing legal games. Which, fair enough as responses go, except it doesn't actually address the substance of FARAGE's allegations. It's the political equivalent of no comment, which in politics speak usually translates to "we're absolutely bricking it but can't say that publicly." The lack of a robust factual rebuttal is telling. If Labor had clear evidence that contradicted FARAGE's claims, they'd be shouting it from the rooftops. Let's talk about what this means for British democracy more broadly, because beyond the immediate political drama, there's a serious constitutional question here. If governments can just indefinitely delay elections whenever the polling looks dodgy, what's the point of having any electoral timetable at all? We might as well go full Roman Empire and just let whoever's in charge stay there until they die or get overthrown. The whole point of regular elections is that governments have to periodically face the electorate and justify their continued existence. It's accountability 101. If that mechanism gets corrupted by governments manipulating timing to an extreme degree, democracy itself starts to break down. FARAGE's team has also raised questions about specific policy announcements Labor's made recently. Several major initiatives have been unveiled with implementation timelines that extend well beyond when an election would normally be expected. Now, you could argue that's just long-term planning, governing responsibly, thinking beyond the next election cycle. Or, and hear me out here, it's evidence that Labor knows they're planning to delay the election and are making decisions based on that knowledge. It's the political equivalent of someone buying a non-refundable holiday for next year when they're supposedly leaving their job next month. The timeline doesn't make sense unless you know something you're not telling everyone else. The legal arguments FARAGE's team is deploying are surprisingly sophisticated. They're not just saying this feels wrong or we don't like it. They're citing constitutional precedent, historical conventions, and potentially even human rights law around democratic participation. The right to vote isn't just about having elections eventually, sometime, whenever the government fancies it. It's about timely elections that give citizens meaningful opportunities to hold their government accountable. If those elections get delayed repeatedly for partisan advantage, you're infringing on fundamental democratic rights. Heavy stuff, this. What makes this particularly explosive is the broader context of public trust in politics. Trust in Westminster is already at historic lows. The expenses scandal, Brexit chaos, Partygate, the revolving door of Tory prime ministers, Labour's own internal warfare. It's been a rough couple of decades for British political credibility. People are cynical. They expect politicians to lie, cheat, and manipulate. But most of that cynicism is baked in, priced into the political market. What really moves the needle is when politicians get caught doing something that confirms everyone's worst suspicions in a way that's impossible to deny. If FARAGE can prove Labour has been deliberately gaming election timing, that's a confirmation of cynicism so perfect it'll metastasize into genuine anger. The Conservative Party, naturally, is watching this with barely concealed glee. They're in opposition, they're rebuilding, and they'd love nothing more than to see Labour's government delegitimized by a major scandal. But they're also being careful not to get too involved, because FARAGE is a complicated ally at best. The Tories need reform voters to come back to the fold, but they can't be seen as FARAGE's puppets. So they're doing that delicate political dance where they express concern about the allegations, call for transparency, and demand answers, all while maintaining just enough distance that they can't be accused of coordinating with FARAGE. It's like watching someone try to benefit from a crime without technically being an accessory. Absolutely fascinating political positioning. The media coverage has been predictably divided along tribal lines. Right-leaning outlets are treating this like the scandal of the century, breathlessly covering every development and speculating about STARMER's potential downfall. Left-leaning media is downplaying it as a FARAGE publicity stunt, questioning his motives and emphasizing that no court has actually ruled on anything yet. The truth, as usual, is probably somewhere in the middle, but nobody's interested in nuance when there's a good political scrap to be had. We're all just tribally picking sides and looking for evidence that confirms what we already believed. Democracy in action, folks.
Here's what's genuinely at stake beyond the immediate political theater. If courts rule that Labor has indeed violated constitutional norms around election timing, the remedies available are potentially nuclear. We could be looking at court-ordered elections. We could see the government's legislative agenda halted. We could witness a constitutional crisis that makes prorogation battles of 2019 look like a minor disagreement. The British Constitution, being largely unwritten and based on conventions rather than rigid rules, is flexible enough to bend quite far before it breaks. But when it breaks spectacularly, and we might be approaching one of those breaking points. FARAGE himself has been remarkably disciplined in his public statements about this, which is saying something for a man not exactly known for his restraint. He's sticking to the legal arguments, avoiding the usual bombast and theatrics, presenting himself as a